Chapter 20 of Midnight. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Midnight by Octavus Roy Cohen. Chapter 20. A Confession. Already dead. Carroll did not know if his lips framed the words or if the walls of the room had echoed. He was startled at a time when he fancied that there could be no further surprise in store for him. He found himself eyeing the woman, and he wondered that he gave credence to her statement. Naomi was sitting straight, large black eyes dilated, hands gripping the arms of the chair tightly, lips slightly parted. Even under the stress of the moment, Carroll was actually conscious of her feminine allure, unable to free himself of her hypnotic personality. She spoke, but he scarcely heard her words through his chaos of thought. "He was dead before I got into the taxicab." He saw that she was fighting to impress upon him the truth of her well-nigh unbelievable statement, that every atom of her brain strove desperately to convince him. And then she relaxed suddenly, as though from too great strain, and a shudder passed over her. "I knew. "You knew what, Mrs. Lawrence?" "I knew that you would not believe me. Oh, it's true, this story I am telling you, but I knew no one could believe it. It stretches one's credulity too far. That is why I have kept silent through all these days which have passed. That, and a desire to save Evelyn and my husband." "You love your husband?" Carroll bit his lips. The question had slipped out before he realized that he had formed the words. But she did not evade the issue. "I despise him, Mr. Carroll. But he has played square with me. More so than I have with him. And publication of this would hurt him." "Because he cares for you?" "No, but because he is proud. Because he is jealous of his personal possessions, of which I am one." "I see. And Mr. Warren?" She spread her hands in a helpless, hopeless gesture. "What's the use, Mr. Carroll? Why should I rack myself with the story when you do not even believe the reason upon which it is based? If you only believed me when I tell you that when I got into the taxicab Roland had already been killed—" "I do believe that," returned Carroll gently. She inbreathed sharply, then her eyes narrowed a trifle. "Do you mean that, or is it bait to make me talk?" "I cannot do more than repeat my statement. I believe what you have told me." She held his eyes for a moment, then slowly hers shrank from the contact. "You are telling me the truth," she ventured. "And if you will tell me the whole story, Mrs. Lawrence, I shall see what I can do for you." "What is there to do for me? There is no way to keep my name from it, my name and the story of the mistake which I made, was willing to make." "Good God, no! If we," he used the pronoun unconsciously, "can establish that, there may be some way of keeping the details from the public. Suppose you start at the beginning, and tell me what there is to tell." She hesitated. "Everything?" "Everything, or nothing. A portion of the story will not help either of us. Of course you don't have to—" Impulsively she leaned forward. "There is something about you, Mr. Carroll, which makes me trust you. I feel that you are a friend rather than an enemy." He bowed gratefully. "Thank you." "It really began shortly after my marriage to Mr. Lawrence." She had started her story before she knew it. "I knew that I had made a mistake. He is nearly 13 years older than I. a man of icy disposition, a nature which is cruel in its frigidity. I am not that kind of a woman, Mr. Carroll. I should not have married that type of man. He was good enough to me in his own peculiar way. I have a little money of my own. He is wealthy. He liked to dress me up and show me off. He was liberal with money, if not with kindness, when there was trouble in my family. After my parents died, he allowed Evelyn to live with us. They have never liked one another, the more reason why I am grateful to him for allowing her to remain in the house. That is the life we have led together. We have long since ceased to have anything in common. He has kept to himself, and I have remained alone. So far as the world knew, our home life was tranquil, unbearably so, to a nature like mine which loves love and life. I grew to hate my husband as a man much as I admired him in certain ways for his brain and his achievement. Our individualities are millions of miles apart. There was no oneness in our married life, and gradually he learned that I hated him, and he became contemptuous. That stung my pride. He didn't care. I felt unsexed. No need to go into further detail. Sufficient to say that I became desperate for a little affection, a little kindness, a little recognition of the fact that I am a woman, and a not entirely unattractive one. It was about then that I met Roland Warren. I wonder if you understand women, Mr. Carroll? I wonder if it is possible for you to comprehend their psychological reactions? Because if you cannot, you will never understand what Roland Warren meant to me. You will never understand the condition which has led to this tragedy." She paused, and Carroll nodded. "You can trust me to understand." "I believe you do. I believe you understand something of what was going on within me when Roland came into my life. In the light of what has transpired, the fact that I was neglected by my husband seems absurd, trivial. But it is not absurd. It is not trivial. Mr. Warren was kind to me. He was attentive, courteous. I believe that he really loved me. I may have been fooled, of course. Starved as I was for the affection of a man, I may have been blind to the sincerity of his protestations. But I believed him. As to how I felt toward him, I don't know. I liked him, admired him. I believe that I loved him. But again we are faced with the abnormal condition in which I found myself. I believe I loved him as I believe he loved me. He represented a chance for life when for 3 years I had been dead, living and breathing, yet dead as a woman. And that is the most terrible of all deaths. We planned to elope. Don't ask me how I could consider such a thing. There is no answer possible. It wasn't a sane decision, but I decided that I would. There was the craving to get away from things, to try to start over, to revel in the richest things of life for a while. I was selfish, unutterably so. I didn't think then of the effect on my husband, or of the effect on Evelyn. I was selfish, yes. But immoral? No. What I planned to do, under the circumstances, was not immoral. Even yet I cannot convince myself that it was. Roland laid all his plans to leave the city. In all my delirium of preparation, the hiding and the secrecy, I felt sincerely sorry for only one person, and that person was Hazel Gresham, to whom Mr. Warren was engaged. I believe she was in love with him. But so was I, And if he loved me, as I said before, Mr. Carroll, I was selfish. On the morning of the day we were to go, my husband was in Nashville, you know. Mr. Warren came to the house in his car. He showed me that he had reserved a drawing room for us to New York. In order that we would not be seen together, he gave me one of the railroad tickets. I was to reach the Union Station 10 minutes before train time. If you recall, the train on which we were to go was quite late that night. We planned not to talk to one another at the station until after boarding the train. Morning would have published news of the scandal broadcast, but until the irrevocable step had been taken, we determined to avoid gossip. And, Mr. Carroll, I was then what is called a good woman. My faithlessness up to that time, and to this moment, had been mental, and mental only. When he left me that morning, he took with him my suitcase. We had agreed that I was not to take a trunk, that I was to buy a trousseau in New York. I looked upon it almost as a honeymoon. He took my suitcase to the Union Station and checked it there. I did not see him again that day. Toward evening, knowing that my husband was not due back until the following morning, and realizing that I could not leave Evelyn alone in the house, I suggested that she spend the night with Hazel Gresham. She was surprised, knowing that I dread to be alone at night, but was ready enough to go. I was not overcome with either emotion or shame when I told her good-bye that afternoon. I was so hungry for happiness that I was dead to the other emotions. I went to the station that night in a streetcar. I had telephoned in advance and learned that the train was late. The night was the worst of the winter, bitterly cold. When I reached the station, I saw that Roland was already there, and as he saw me enter he left through the opposite door, walking out to the platform which parallels the railroad tracks. Then from the outside he motioned me to follow. He wanted to talk to me, but would not risk doing so where we might be seen. I sat down for a while, then, as casually as I could, followed him onto the station platform. I saw him down at the far end and near the baggage room. Again he motioned to me to follow him, and he started out past the baggage room into the railroad yards. I was very grateful to him. He was taking no risk of our being seen together. I followed slowly, not seeing him, but knowing that he would be waiting for me out there. You understand where I mean? It is in that section of the railroad yards where through trains leave their early morning Pullmans. The tracks are parallel to Atlantic Avenue, and also the main line tracks running into the Union Station shed. I was conscious of the intense cold, but excitement buoyed me up. I passed through the gate which ordinarily bars passengers from the tracks, but which that night had either been left open or opened by Roland. The wind, as I stepped from under the shelter of the station shed, was terrific, howling across the yards, stinging with sleet. It was very slippery underfoot. I had to watch closely. And I was just a trifle nervous because here and there through the yards I could see lanterns. Yard workers and track walkers, I presume. And occasionally the headlights of a switch engine zigzagged across the tracks. I was afraid I'd be caught in the glare. Finally I saw Warren. He had walked about 150 yards down the track and was standing in the shelter of the Pullman office building. It was very dark there, just enough light for me to make out his silhouette. I started forward, then stopped, frightened, for I distinctly saw the figure of a man coming into the yards from Atlantic Avenue. From the moment I noticed him, I had the peculiar impression that the man had not only seen Mr. Warren and intended speaking to him, but also that the meeting was not unexpected. I stopped where I was and strained my eyes through the darkness. I could not see much, save that they were talking. Of course I could hear nothing. I was shivering, but more with premonition of tragedy than with the terrific cold. Then suddenly I saw the two shadows merge. The combined shadows whirled strangely. I knew that Mr. Warren was fighting with this other man. I started forward again. Then I saw one of the shadows step back from the other. There was the flash of a revolver. No noise, because a train was rolling under the shed at the moment. But I saw the flash of the gun. I stood motionless, horrified. I didn't advance, didn't run. I knew that the man who had been shot was Mr. Warren. I didn't know what to do. I felt suddenly lost, hopeless. And watching, I saw one figure stoop and lift the prostrate man. He dragged him across the tracks to the inky darkness between the Pullman offices and the rear of the baggage room. I don't know what he did there, but I remember looking toward Atlantic Avenue and seeing a yellow taxicab parked against the curb. I could see that there was no one in the driver's seat, and while I watched, I saw the man who had done the shooting drag Mr. Warren's body to the taxicab. It was dark in the street. The arc light on the corner was out. I saw him throw Mr. Warren's body into the taxicab. It was then that I turned and fled toward the station. I can't tell you how I felt. At a time like that one doesn't pause to analyze one's emotional reactions. I was conscious of horror, of that and the idea that I must save myself. And then the thought struck me that perhaps Mr. Warren was not dead. Perhaps he was only badly wounded. If that were the case, I knew that he would freeze to death in the cab. It was necessary to get to him. By that time I had reached the waiting room. I saw his suitcase, and then, Mr. Carroll, I thought of something else. Something which made it imperative that I get to Mr. Warren. She stopped suddenly. Carroll, eyes wide with interest, motioned her on. You thought of something? Something which made it necessary for you to get to him? Yes. I remembered that he had in his pocket the check for my suitcase. He had checked it himself that day. I realized in a flash that there would be a police investigation, and the minute that checkroom stub was found, the detectives would have followed it up. They would have discovered my suitcase. My name would then have been indelibly linked with his, in that way. So there were two reasons why I knew I must get into that taxicab. To recover the suitcase check, and to either assure myself that he was dead, or else take him where he could get expert medical attention. Almost before I knew what I was doing, I seized his suitcase, which he had left on the floor of the waiting room. I left the station along with several passengers who had come in on the local train. I called the taxicab. I told him to drive me to some place on East End Avenue, gave him some address which I knew was a long distance away, so that I would have time to learn if he was dead, and if he wasn't, to get him to a doctor's, and if he was, to find the check, the finding of which in his pocket would have connected me with the affair. He was dead. She paused, choked, and went on gamely. I got out of the taxicab when it slowed down at a railroad crossing. I walked half the distance back to town, then caught the last streetcar home. Her voice died away. Carroll relaxed slowly. Then a puzzled frown creased his forehead. "The man who did the actual shooting," he said quietly. "Have you the slightest idea as to his identity?" "No." Her manner was almost indifferent. The strain was over, she was hardly conscious of what she was saying. "He was smaller than Mr. Warren. A man of about my husband's size." She stopped abruptly. Carroll's gaze grew steely. He made a note of the expression of horror in her eyes. "About your husband's size," he repeated softly. Chapter 21.